Hey guys, Will here. So as you can see, we are absolutely buried in boxes today. We're finally checking out the brand new Fanatec ClubSport Cockpit. Now, two of these boxes are the cockpit itself. We've got the seat here, we've got a single monitor mount, a triple monitor mount, and all of these other accessories. In today's video, we're going to be focusing primarily on the cockpit itself and some of the accessories that bolt directly onto it. In a separate video, we will also be taking a look at the external single and triple monitor mount, as well as some other less fundamental accessories for the cockpit too. So at the price point that they're asking for this thing, it does have an awful lot to live up to, and I'm sure the same question that we've asked in the past when it comes to cockpits of this style will relate here as well. Why buy this and not just a standard aluminium profile cockpit? So we're going to be taking you through as much detail as we possibly can, everything from what this thing is like to build to what it's like to actually live with. And by the end of today's video, you should have a much clearer picture of whether something like this is going to be the best bet for your particular situation, or whether you're better off just going for a more conventional aluminium profile style cockpit. So without further ado, let's dive in and check out the ClubSport Cockpit from Fanatec. Okay, so we do have an awful lot of detail to go through in today's video. This has turned out to be a lot more complicated and nuanced than I thought it was going to be. But before we get started, firstly, just a quick mention of a couple of important housekeeping things, just so you have the full picture of exactly what we're doing today. So firstly, as always, big thank you to Fanatec for sending across this cockpit and all the accessories that you see for review purposes today. Now, we will, as we always do, be cross-comparing against a lot of other products in today's video as well, just to give you a better understanding of what's going to suit your particular situation best. So it's important that you guys are aware that all the other cockpits and accessories and bits and pieces that we'll be talking about in today's video were all sent to us for review purposes under the exact same conditions as what we're talking about here, with the one exception that my daily driver P1X cockpit from SimLab I did actually purchase many years ago. So with that being crystal clear, do also just want to quickly let you know that we do have a bunch of affiliate links and discount codes available for various different cockpits and sim racing products in general. Head over to boostedmedia.net or just check out the links down in the description below. So using those links are not only a great way of helping support us without it costing you an extra cent, but in some cases it can also save you a little bit of money as well. So check out the links down below or head over to boostedmedia.net for all the details on that. But so yeah, what we'll do now is we'll get stuck into this with a little bit of detail on pricing, and then we'll move on into what it was like to build and what it's like to live with. Okay, so in terms of pricing, you're looking at $1,000 for the basic cockpit. Once you kit it out with the seat and all the other bits and pieces that you see on the rig in front of us today, you're looking at just under $2,000. Now that does sound quite expensive. We've done a bit of an analysis on the market in general, and look, it's not outrageously expensive, at least on paper, compared to a lot of the other options that are out there. But what we're gonna do here is, rather than spend a whole bunch of time talking about every single comparison we've ever tested over the years, because there's so many of them, I'm gonna refer you across to our written review of this cockpit, where we've put together a bit of a comparison chart with some of the other cockpits that we've tested over the years to give you regional pricing, the pricing of each individual accessory, and give you a lot more context around that without spending hours and hours and hours going through it all now in today's videos. So if you are genuinely looking at buying one of these things and you're not just curious about it, I'll pin a comment down below this video, and that will link you directly to our written review, which will take you into a lot more detail around pricing and comparisons. But just to reiterate there, $1,000 for the basic cockpit. That doesn't include the seat. Once you accessorize it with the seat, the side mounts, the shifter mount, the keyboard tray, the PC tray, and all those bits and pieces, you are getting much closer to $2,000. The basic price does, though, include the integrated single monitor mount, which I think is worth calling out because some other cockpits don't include that. But anyway, let's move on now and talk about what this thing was actually like to put together. It was a bit of a mixed experience, and some of you guys might have already seen some of our Facebook posts as we were going through this process, highlighting some of the issues that we had. But let's go into all the detail now on exactly what you need to know with regards to putting this thing together. So unboxing and assembly. Now, you guys saw in the intro that we were absolutely buried in a million boxes. As I mentioned in the intro, the cockpit itself does consist of two individual boxes. The seat is then an extra box, and then obviously any additional accessories that you order will come individually packaged too. Actually taking the things out of the boxes, I was very impressed with how much padding there was, how well protected everything was, with the exception of just a tiny little scuff on the top of the triple monitor stand. Everything else was in absolutely pristine condition. There were no issues at all with damage or anything being bent or scuffed or anything like that. So yeah, they've definitely done a very good job and put a lot of effort into their packaging. The other thing that they've done an absolutely incredible job of, and I don't say that lightly, is the actual documentation for putting this thing together. They have a QR code on each individual box. You scan that code, it brings up the manual, And yeah, the instructions are extremely clear. The thing I really like is that they've done both visual and written instructions. So if you're the sort of person that finds it easier to follow diagrams rather than written steps, they've got you covered either way. So that was really, really simple. I found that I could just kind of look at the picture and understand what to do. I did probably spend a little bit more time than I needed to, just sort of really digesting those instructions as we were going through, just to make absolutely sure for the purposes of the video that I was doing things exactly the way they intend you to do. And there were a couple of steps that I thought were maybe a little bit backwards or a little bit out of sequence. One thing in particular that jumped out to me is that they kind of get you to assemble the frame of the cockpit and then flip the whole thing over to put the feet on afterwards. Whereas, if you're building it yourself, it's much easier to put those feet on when it's not a big heavy cockpit that you've got to flip the whole thing over. So just little things like that I think could be refined a little bit, but that is nitpicking. Overall, I have to say, I think they've done an absolutely exceptional job with how clear the instructions are. And obviously they've put a lot of effort into that. They understand their market, and yeah, that was really, really great to see. So having seen that, before I actually started putting things together, I was expecting a very similar experience to what we had with the Cooler Master cockpit that we reviewed recently. You might remember, if you've seen that review, I commented that that thing was an absolute pleasure to put together. It was just really rewarding, really easy. Everything just fit together perfectly. There was no issues with misalignment or cross-threading or anything like that. So that was what I was expecting based on my initial experience to have with this particular cockpit. Now, if you've seen my Facebook posts that I made as we were building this thing, you would have seen that we did actually run into some pretty significant issues with the build process of this thing. So this is going to become a bit of a general theme as we get through today's video. But what I would say became abundantly clear very quickly upon starting to put this thing together is that the design itself, they've obviously put a lot of thought and effort into. This is very, very, very clearly been designed by somebody that has a lot of experience sim racing and knows exactly what it is that sim racers want and need. So that kind of, again, shaped what I was expecting out of the experience of putting this thing together. But when it came to actually assembling the thing, as you guys saw on my social media posts, we did run into a lot of issues with screws not wanting to go into their appropriate holes. And basically the issue there was a couple of things. The first thing being that they've painted the steel tubes after the threads have already been tapped in all of the holes. So what that means is that the thickness of the material is too thick. So as you're putting the screw in, you're actually almost like having to cut a new thread in a lot of the holes. And I would say in our particular experience, more holes had that issue than didn't. So that immediately made it a very frustrating thing to put together. There were also a couple of areas on both the monitor stand and the cockpit itself where they've welded nuts onto the back of the steel tube to receive the bolts as they come through the tube. And in a couple of cases there as well, the nuts weren't quite welded on in exactly the right spot. And in those cases, it was actually impossible to get the bolt through without it cross-threading, because just like I'm assuming the majority of people that are building one of these things at home, you're not going to have the equipment to, cut off a welded bolt and then weld a new one on yourself. So those are the kinds of things that at this kind of price point, I wouldn't have expected you to encounter. And yeah, as I was saying, it just became abundantly clear that the design is very clever, but it has been let down with the material quality and just the general manufacturing of the components themselves. So yeah, we put that post out on social media, and the reason I did that wasn't to sort of try and create drama or anything like that. I don't like talking about reviews that we're working on before we actually finish them, because I don't want to sort of start to steer people in a certain direction. But given that this is a product that's already available in the mass market, there are already a lot of people that own these things, and I thought it would add a lot of value for you guys if we sort of polled the existing customer base to find out whether the experience that we were having was atypical or typical of what other people were also experiencing. And look, honestly, it was a mixed bag. We had probably a 50-50 split between people that said that it went together absolutely fine with no issues whatsoever, and people that said that they were experiencing similar issues to what we had. So make of that what you guys will. I can't guarantee that your experience is going to be the same as ours, but this is the experience that we had, and we can only review what we've got in front of us here. But I did want to just add to this review that, not everybody had the same experience that we had here. But yeah, it really just came down to those two things. The holes themselves being painted over, which meant that we had to re-tap a lot of the threads to get screws to go in properly, and some of those welded nuts that just weren't quite in the exact right position, which obviously if they're not in exactly the right position, you then can't get the bolt in without cross-threading. So that took what should have been a really fun and enjoyable experience of putting something together into something that just had us, ready to throw it across the room a couple of times, to be honest with you guys. It was extremely frustrating trying to get this thing together. And, just in the back of my mind while I'm building it, I'm thinking, if I'd paid this kind of money for this thing, and I mean, obviously it's different for us as reviewers because we do get sent things for free. And you know, there's probably a whole video in discussing that, whether that creates bias or whether you're likely to be more biased if you've actually paid money for something, because obviously confirmation bias becomes a thing as well. But what I can tell you unequivocally is that it did leave me at multiple times throughout the build process thinking to myself, if I'd paid $2,000 for this setup, I would be very, very, very frustrated with what I was having to face in putting it together. And it's as simple as that, guys. So yeah, look, I mean, in general, the instructions were absolutely fine. It was very simple in terms of what you needed to do. All the steps were very clear, but it was just let down by those little manufacturing defects, which in my opinion should not be an issue. And I'm sure you guys will agree with me at this kind of price point. And in fairness, hasn't been an issue with other cockpits that have come in at a similar price point that we've tested before. So before we move on, I do want to just sort of highlight the fact that all of that negative stuff that we just mentioned does all just relate to actually putting the thing together. Once it's all together and it's all built, none of that stuff is really going to matter unless, of course, you ever need to pull it apart again. If you've got anything that's cross-threaded, that could end up being a bit of a nightmare. If you're looking at just buying one of these things from a third party pre-built with all the gear already installed on it, none of those things are really going to matter to you. So just keep that in mind as well. I don't want to sort of, you know, tarnish the overall review with the negative experience that we had putting the thing together. But of course, for those of you who are buying it, disassembled and having to put it together, that is going to be an important part of the experience. So we certainly didn't want to sort of gloss over it either. So that covers the unboxing and assembly process, bit of a mixed bag there. Let's move on now and talk about some of the features of this setup. So anytime that I'm reviewing a sim racing cockpit, regardless of the price point, there's three things that I'm looking for: adjustability, rigidity, and expandability. And all three of these are a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to the Fanatec ClubSport Cockpit. Let's start off with adjustability. This is where I think probably this cockpit is a little bit stronger than I was perhaps expecting it to be, and definitely one of the strongest on the market, which might surprise some people considering that it's not a aluminium profile cockpit, but bear with me, we'll explain it all as we go through here. So the way to think of this cockpit, as is the case with most steel tube frame type cockpits like this, the wheel is kind of the fixed point in space and everything else can kind of adjust around that. Now, they've got some really clever mechanisms here, which I was actually surprised at how well they work. You'll notice on the wheel deck here, as well as on the pedal tray, you've got these sliders and you've got these little ratchet style bolts here, which you can tighten or loosen and then just pivot around by lifting up so that they're aligned correctly and not looking ugly and out of place on the rig. But yeah, if you loosen these off, you've got some little roller bearings inside these mechanisms here, and that actually allows you to slide the entire thing forward and back like so, which works really, really nicely, allows you to get it in any position, and it's not notched at all. So you can literally put it anywhere you want within the scope of range of adjustment here. And I like that they've also made these little markings here too. So you'll notice this in a few different places in the cockpit. It's not the first time we've seen something like this, but it allows you to sort of, you know, remember where you like to have it, so you can always get it in exactly the same place. So if you've got multiple people using your rig, then they can jump in and just put it straight to the spot that they want it in as well. But this works really well. We'll talk about the flex related to this in just a moment. I'm going to put it back in the position that I like it, which is right here. And then we also have the ability to tilt the wheel deck up and down from here as well. So you've got a little stopper here, and then you can loosen the little ratchets. And again, you can pivot these to be in any position you want so they don't look ugly on the cockpit. So you do that on both sides. And then that gives you the ability to tilt the entire wheelbase up and down. So if you prefer a more formula style seating position where you've got the seat low, the pedals high, and the wheel kind of angled more towards you like this, you can certainly achieve that. Most people are going to want to have the wheel this kind of an angle. It doesn't have the provision for a more truck style setup. So you can't drop the pedals super low like you would have in a truck or a bus or something like that, and then have an extreme angle on the wheel to have it more upright. But I don't think the majority of people buying a cockpit like this are really looking for that anyway. So I don't really see that to be a massive detractor, but I just wanted to show you the scope of movement here. Now, you do also have a little bit of adjustment up and down. You can see there's a second row of bolts just here, so you can drop the entire wheel deck down one notch. which equates to about 10 millimeters, but you don't have an easy way to just raise or lower the entire deck like what you would on an aluminium profile cockpit, for example, where you can just loosen the bolts and slide it up and down the channels. Now, that's not necessarily a deal breaker because pretty much everything else on the cockpit can adjust, and there is quite a large scope of adjustment for both the pedal tray and the seat, as we'll see in just a moment. So if you're finding that the wheel deck is just too low for you or too high, for most people, you will be able to adjust the height of your seat and your pedals to get you in the position that you want for the wheel deck. So it doesn't necessarily matter that you don't have a lot of up and down adjustment for the wheel deck, but we'll lock this back into position for now. And again, we will come back and talk about flex in just a moment. So let's move down to the pedal tray now. And you can see this has got a very similar mechanism to what we saw on the wheel deck, just a larger scale. So you've got two quick release knobs on the back there, which you can loosen off. And once you do that, you can see we can push the pedal tray all the way back. So it's actually out of reach. I'm 6 foot tall and I do have quite long legs. So at the moment, I've got the seat in the far back position and the pedals as far away as they can go. And obviously, depending on the pedals that you have installed on the pedal tray will ultimately determine exactly where the pedals sit relative to the tray itself. But I can tell you that that is too far away from me. And if I bring it all the way forward, it gets crazy, crazy, crazy close. So like, obviously I can't drive that. Now you might be thinking, well, that's ideal for small children. But again, do just factor in the fact that, you know, they're going to be sitting much lower in the cockpit than you might expect. So the wheel height might not necessarily work well for them. You will have to raise the level of the seat to compensate for that to some extent. But yeah, heaps of adjustment there. And you can also see the mechanism for the pedal tray itself is a really clever design. So again, you've got two more of these ratchet style bolts here, and you can just loosen those. And rather than having to unscrew it all the way, they've got this really clever system with these slots. So you can raise and lower the pedal tray or tilt it. And it is a lot easier to make those adjustments than it is on any other cockpit that I've tested, at least in the past. So I would say that between the slider and the raising and lower mechanism that we have here, this is probably the best design that I've seen in terms of ease of adjustability and being able to adapt between different drivers. And again, this plays into what I was saying before about obviously the person that's designed this has spent a lot of time and understands what it is that is important to sim racers. So yeah, very, very good to see that, but I'll get that locked back into the correct position for me now and we can move on to the seat adjustment. You can see this has got a very similar mechanism to what we saw with the pedal tray before, where you can just loosen these bolts rather than having to completely remove them and then raise or lower the seat or angle it into the exact position that you want. And then on top of that as well, we do also have an automotive quality seat slider here too. So you just pull up the rail, and you can see now I can slide the seat all the way forward, way more than I would ever need to, all the way up here. And then if I wanted to, I could then slide this back as well. So this is back here, and you can imagine the pedals can literally be right up against the seat if you wanted them to. So there's a massive amount of adjustability available here. And yeah, once you factor in the fact that you can raise the seat up quite significantly here as well, you're not going to have any problems whatsoever if you've got a group of mates coming over that all want to be able to use your rig. And you know, you're not going to be having to spend 15 minutes in between drivers adjusting things or anything crazy like that. So in terms of overall adjustability, I think they've done a really good job here. You can also adjust the position of the integrated monitor as well. That can slide all the way forward and back, as you see here. We will put the monitor on this obviously later on and explain how all that works. You can of course also raise and lower the monitor to some extent at least to account for different size screens as well as the exact position that you might want to have that in. But we'll talk about that more when we get the monitor mounted up and talk about the driving experience a little bit later on. So in terms of fundamental adjustability when it comes to the wheel, the pedal and the seat position, everything is pretty good. Where things start to fall over a little bit is when it comes to the adjustability of the shifter and handbrake. So let me just get these all locked off in my correct driving position again, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that. So when it comes to your shifter and handbrake, there are a couple of additional factors to consider. Firstly, whether you're going to want to have it on the left or right hand side. So they do have these optional accessories, which are these mounting bars, and you have to choose whether you want to have a left hand side or a right hand side one, or just buy both of them. And obviously that does come at an additional expense. So there is that factor. They aren't just interchangeable between sides. So you can't, if you order a right hand side one, then decide you want to have it on the left like you could with an aluminium profile cockpit. So factor that into your decision, of course. So these rails essentially have T-slot channels built into them. And then they've got these little mounting brackets that have these quick release levers on them that allow you to, in theory at least, slide your shifter and handbrake into whatever position you want to use. So you release those quick release levers, and then you can see straight away we've got an issue where we just don't have a lot of clearance here to work with. So you end up not really being able to, because once you loosen that quick release lever, you can't then unscrew it to slide this into the position that you want. So you end up having to kind of loosen it with it already in the locked position, which is just awkward, and then loosen this one as well. And remember again that, this isn't something that you're going to be adjusting all the time unless you're changing between drivers. But in contrast to how easy it was to kind of adjust everything else into the position that you want, this is a lot more awkward. So you kind of loosen those off, and then you can slide this forward and back. But you can see now it is scratching up these rails pretty badly. And we've only adjusted this maybe 3 or 4 times up until this point, and it's already starting to get some pretty nasty scuff marks on it. And that is, even if we do loosen it off a lot more than what we had here. Now we'll get into this more when we talk about expandability in just a moment, but you'll notice that we've got the Fanatec load cell handbrake mounted directly to the side of their H pattern / sequential shifter. There is also an additional piece available here which bolts into the side here for installing other handbrakes. So you aren't only limited to the Fanatec handbrake in this configuration that you see here, but we'll get into that in more detail. I just want to quickly cover that just in case you were wondering exactly what you were looking at here. But yeah, that can slide into whatever position you want along here. And of course, keeping in mind that many people aren't going to have their seat in the exact position that I do. So if I've got my seat further forward and my wheel deck further away from me like this, then all of a sudden this makes more sense to have the handbrake and shifter a little bit further forward. Where things start to get really awkward here though is when it comes to the keyboard tray. Now you can see this is mounted on the same rail, and you kind of have to make a decision whether you want to have it in front or behind the shifter. But once you do that, it becomes really difficult to articulate around. So you can see it does raise and lower, and it's quite a cool design here. But if you want to be able to sort of get it up in front of you, like so, you end up bashing into the wheel, or the handbrake ends up being in the way. You can see my seating position that I've got now, that handbrake and shifter are way too far away from me. So if I bring those closer again, I would want to have them in line with the wheel like what we see here. We'll lock this one again too, quickly. So that is now locked off. But you can see now if I want to get my keyboard around in front of me, it's going to bash into my handbrake, and it just becomes an awkward mess. And it's just as awkward if you have it on the other side as well. So when you consider the price that you're paying for this keyboard tray, the two options are either you put it on the other side, which means you have to buy the left-hand side rail as well just to have that mounted on the opposing side, which I don't think most people would want to have to do. Or, just put your keyboard and mouse on a table next to you, which is what I would do, honestly. I just can't recommend paying the extra money for this when the way that it's mounted is so limiting. So yeah, I mean, it works in theory. And if you always have your keyboard off to the side of you like this, it's okay. But I do find, for me at least, if I'm sort of twisting my back all the time to try and lean over to a keyboard that's, just awkwardly placed, I do end up with back pain and, fatigue and things like that. So for me, I'd much rather just have, even with the seat as low as it is now, you could just literally have the keyboard and mouse sitting on the floor and then just pick it up and use it when you need to. So yeah, look, I don't particularly like this keyboard tray design. In fairness, in general, I'm not a big fan of these integrated keyboard and mouse trays anyway. I just think they always end up being overly complicated, at least in my experience, and not worth the money that you pay for them. It's easy to just have a little table next to you and just put the keyboard and mouse on that. But hopefully that sort of demonstrates the limitations that we have here. So just to quickly summarize on adjustability, I think compared to an aluminium profile cockpit, when it comes to the kinds of adjustments that you would be making to adapt between two different drivers, or maybe an adult and a child driver, I think this is actually a lot easier to work with than any other aluminium profile cockpit that I've ever worked with, simply because when you're unbolting things and wanting to move things around, typically you're taking the weight of the thing that you're unbolting, whereas with this, it's just a quick release lever or a ratchet or something that you undo, slide it into the position you want, and then lock it off again. So it does genuinely make it something that you can adjust easily between drivers, rather than something that just ends up being too much of a pain in the ass to really bother with. So there are some limitations there, of course, but overall, I think they've done a really good job. Let's move on now and talk about rigidity, which unfortunately isn't quite so positive. So as I mentioned when we were talking about adjustability, anytime that you add adjustability to a rig, you are introducing areas where potential flex can start to creep in. And unfortunately, there is more flex than I was hoping for in a cockpit of this kind of price point pretty much throughout this entire thing. Now, unfortunately for Fanatec / Corsair, where I think most of this flex is coming from is not from the design of the cockpit, but more from the quality materials. And this ties into what we were talking about before when it comes to, just the overall build quality isn't as good as I was expecting it to be for the price, despite the design itself being really good. So to start off here over in the handbrake and shifter area, like we were talking about before, you've got this mounting rail here. Now, shifting gears, not too bad. You can see when I do slam over into reverse or slam over into 7th gear on this particular shifter, we do have quite a bit of flex there. And that does sort of break the immersion, because in a real car, you're not, you know, having the thing moving around anywhere near that much. But look, just changing between 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, it's not too bad. When we pull on the handbrake, you can see now we're starting to get a lot of flex here. And of course, it will depend on the style of handbrake that you're using. This is a load cell handbrake. But look, again, to put it in the correct perspective here, people that are spending this kind of money on a cockpit are likely going to have a relatively high-end shifter and handbrake as well. So I don't think it's unfair to use Fanatec's own load cell handbrake in this context. But you can see as we pull on that, there is a lot of flex. Everything is moving around, particularly if you have a keyboard tray on the same side. You can see when I pull that handbrake, that keyboard tray is moving at the extremity here by, I would say, over an inch up and down, which is, I mean, you can decide for yourself whether that's acceptable or not. To me, that would really annoy me, but you know, you might not be so sensitive to that kind of thing. But also just, you know, typing here as well, you can see how much this whole assembly just kind of bounces around. Now, because there's so many different points of attachment here, there's a little bit of flex coming from a lot of different areas, but the majority of the flex, unfortunately, is actually coming from this bar twisting. So when I pull on that handbrake, you can see there's not really a whole lot of flex in the mount or anything like that. It's actually this entire assembly twisting on the rail itself, which means that there's not really a clean way to reinforce that. If you're mounting just a standard handbrake and shifter on a, you know, some sort of aluminium plate that's bolting directly into T-nuts on this rail, you still have the exact same issue because the entire rail itself is twisting. So again, I think it just comes down to the quality of the material that they're using here. I think they needed to use thicker steel to counteract that flex. And, you know, I would love to know whether, you know, the initial design did call for thicker materials throughout, and whether, you know, just cost cutting crept in and they ended up just not really sort of utilizing the design to its full extent. But I mean, it almost calls for like a pro version of this cockpit that costs more, but, you know, has thicker materials throughout, because the design itself is so good, but it's just let down by things like that. And, you know, if we move across now to the wheel deck as well, you can see there is quite a lot of flex there. And look, you'll see in the driving footage, but this is noticeable when you're driving. I mean, you know, obviously pulling up and down on it like this does exaggerate the effect, but you can see because the thickness of the material here just isn't thick enough to be flex free, and it doesn't have any additional ribbing or anything like that, the entire mounting surface does just bend as I pull up and down on the wheel. Now, it's not a massive amount of flex, and I have tested some aluminium profile cockpit wheel decks that do have a similar amount of flex to this. But look, again, when you're paying this kind of money, you just don't expect to have any flex whatsoever. And unfortunately, it is exactly the same with the front mount. But yeah, it just comes down to the thickness of the material here. If they use thicker steel, that wouldn't be an issue. And particularly when you put it in the context of some of these modern wheelbases that we're talking about now, with things like true force, full force, and those high frequency, high fidelity effects, any flex or movement in the wheel deck whatsoever is going to have a damping effect. Whether you notice it tangibly or not, it will be damping down those kinds of high frequency effects, because it's basically absorbing those vibrations, taking them away from what you feel and absorbing them through the rig. So you might not say that it's noticeable, but then if you jump into a rig that doesn't have any flex in it, you will absolutely feel the difference. So yeah, I think that is important to call out. You know, 5 years ago, I probably would have said that's an acceptable amount of flex, but with these high fidelity wheelbases that we have now, it is something that he's going to be taking away from the experience. So I do think that they needed to do a better job. And again, it does just come down to the thickness of material. The overall design here, you can see there's not flex between the two halves. So it's not like the joints or anything are bad quality. From what I can see, there's no flex coming from these mechanisms, this sliding mechanism at all, which did surprise me. It's purely just down to the thickness of the material down here, which I think is just a bad decision when it comes to the manufacturing. Obviously, it would have added additional cost, but it's such an easy fix that I just don't see why they didn't do it. Moving down to the pedal tray as well. Again, I really like the design here, but the thickness of the material, once again, just introduces flex that doesn't need to be there. And again, I've tried to be fair here. I'm trying to use a relatively common set of pedals in the SimMagic P1000s that I would expect people that are spending this kind of money on a cockpit would likely be using. So this does have its own integrated pedal tray as well, which does reduce the amount of flex. But even still, you can see when I push down, you can see the entire thing does dip down. Now, look, I would say that that is in the realm of acceptable. It's not something that you're going to notice a massive amount when driving or anything like that. But you know, it is taking away fidelity, and particularly in this modern era with force feedback pedals. Again, just like what we were discussing with the wheelbase, anything that's flexing or moving is going to have a damping effect on any sort of haptic feedback. So while it may not impact the consistency of your braking because it is always flexing the same amount, I just can't understand why they didn't spend a little bit more money making the material a little bit thicker just to get rid of that flex. And again, you can see it's not the adjustment points. It's not anything like that that's flexing. It's purely just down to the thickness of the material just not being sufficient to eliminate that flex. And again, if you compare this to the pedal trays that you would get in a similarly priced aluminium profile cockpit, in my experience at least, those just don't have any flex whatsoever when it comes to the actual pedal trays themselves in most cases. And again, of course, you can check out individual reviews of different cockpits to, you know, verify which ones do and don't have flex like that. But in general, a lot more flex here than you would expect from a similarly priced aluminium profile cockpit. So yeah, that was, you know, not unacceptable, but definitely disappointing, I would say, considering how easy it would have been for them to just make the material thicker and not have that issue in the first place. And yeah, again, it comes back to that whole point of the design being good, but the materials just letting it down a little bit. Now the seat as well, the seat did come packaged as two separate halves to obviously save on shipping costs. You bolt the two halves together, and I was expecting that that would actually introduce quite a bit of flex. Now, rigidity in your seat is very, very important, particularly if you are using a high-end set of load cell pedals, or even, you know, medium sort of grade load cell pedals, because you are, when you're braking, creating a brace between your foot and the small of your back. So when you're pushing down, you should be braking with your thigh and the muscles here. You shouldn't be braking with your ankle. And when you push on the brake, an equal amount of force is actually going into the back of the seat as well. So you can see when I do a heavy brake here, that entire seat is flexing quite a lot. Now, it's not actually the two halves and the way they're bolted together that's creating that flex. Again, it's the material choice that they've used for this particular seat. It's like a ABS plastic kind of material. And unfortunately, it just has a whole lot of flex in it. And then, I mean, there is a little bit of flex coming from the fact that we've got seat rails here. There is a little bit of flex coming from the thin material that they've used for the seat rails themselves. And if you get in there, you can actually see as I brake, the entire mount is actually twisting slightly towards the back. So there's a little bit of flex coming from various different areas within the design there, but the majority of the flex is actually coming from the plastic seat itself. And you can see if I actually hop up out of the seat, just pulling on the back of the seat here, you can see how the whole entire thing squeezes in. And you know, the plastic again is just too soft. It doesn't provide the rigidity that I would expect for a cockpit of this kind of price point. So, I mean, look, it is a very comfortable seat. I've got no complaints at all when it comes to the overall design of it. Again, it's just let down by the thickness of the material choices. And yeah, it's as simple as that. So I'll jump back in again, but look, if it was your first cockpit, you probably wouldn't have an issue with it because you wouldn't know any different. But if you were to swap this seat out with a genuinely rigid seat, you are going to feel more consistency in your braking. You're going to feel more connected to the car. Again, it is going to absorb any sort of haptic feedback as well. So if you're looking at running a butt kicker or something like that, you are going to be damping and absorbing a lot of those effects into the flex in the seat rather than actually feeling those through your body. So all these things, you know, if you were talking about a cheap cockpit, you'd say it's acceptable. But if I was spending this much money, given my experience with other cockpits and different seats, I think that the seat could have been a lot better, but again, it's down to the material choices rather than the design itself. It's very comfortable, very well supported. Everything is in exactly the right space. My shoulders feel well supported, my head feels well supported. It's literally just that soft plastic that's letting it down. So again, you can see how this theme is kind of going throughout the entire cockpit. Design-wise, really, really, really good. Material choice and manufacturing, is what is letting it down in terms of flex. But let's move on now and talk about expandability. Now, I would hope that it'd be obvious to most people that there are going to be some sacrifices when you're comparing a tube frame style cockpit to an aluminium profile cockpit, because aluminium profile has, you know, channels everywhere where you can put T-nuts. You can move things around pretty much indefinitely within the scope of adjustment available on each individual length of profile at least. So you're always going to be able to bolt on and take off and adjust appendages in all kinds of different places that you just can't do with tube frame cockpits. So I wanted to establish that straight out of the gate because, you know, it's not really fair to directly compare the experience between something like that and something like this. There are other reasons why somebody might want to choose a cockpit like this over a cockpit like an aluminium profile, for example. So I'm going to be approaching this section of the video as less of a comparison and more just kind of showing you guys exactly what you can do and can't do with this particular cockpit, so you can judge it for yourselves whether it's going to be frustrating or whether it's going to suit your needs just fine. So I already touched on the channels that we have here for mounting things like your shifter and handbrake. We do have T-slot channels available on the top left and bottom half, or right if you were using it on the left hand side. Remembering again, you do have to buy a separate accessory for left hand side and right hand side. You can't just swap sides like you can with aluminium profile, but you can just insert T-nuts, and they do include some T-nuts in the packaging. You can just pop those in like you would an aluminium profile cockpit and then just bolt whatever appendages you want onto these rails. As you can see, you don't have a rail on the outside here, so if you're wanting to mount things on the outside edge, that is not going to be a possibility without having some sort of an adapter bracket. So that is one limitation that hopefully should be pretty obvious. Now the frame itself doesn't have any channels in it, so mounting this to something like a spring or motion platform is going to be a lot more challenging as well. Maybe they'll come out with some sort of a frame or accessory later on down the line that will add that compatibility, but that will come at an additional cost, whereas with aluminium profile, of course, again, you can, in most cases at least, just bolt a motion system directly on. So that is a limitation as well, but again, you kind of already accept that. But as you can see, throughout the tubes here, there's not really any provision for bolting any additional accessories onto here. We do have accessories like the PC tray that we'll talk about in just a moment, but as you can see, there's just no mounting holes anywhere else on the rig, pretty much anywhere, to allow you to bolt on appendages, accessories, and so forth, unless you buy these additional brackets here. Now, these are an optional accessory, so they do come at an additional cost. Now, look, this is the one thing on this design, like everything we've said so far, the design kind of makes sense, but the implementation maybe wasn't quite where it could have been. The design of these things just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So the idea here is that these create a mounting surface for you to be able to bolt on things like webcams, button boxes, and so forth onto your rig. So you can see, again, just like what we have here, we've got T-slot channels on the top, the back, and the bottom, but we don't have a T-slot channel on the front. And that, to me, just makes absolutely no sense. Now, even in their own marketing here on their own website, if you scroll down a little bit, you can see they've got a webcam that they're mounting here with an accessory like this. So basically the webcam is sitting on top of the tripod head, and then the bottom is bolting in. Now they do include in the package these little plastic adapters that give you a flat surface to mount on, but you've got a hole here, you've got a T-nut which inserts into the channel, so that would go in there. How are you supposed to bolt something? You know, you've got to have a bolt that goes through on both ends. And, you know, this is going to be the same issue on an aluminium profile cockpit, of course, as well. You're going to have a stud that bolts through. But, you know, it just doesn't make any sense from their own marketing. They're saying it makes it easy to mount things like that. But, you know, as you can see, it just doesn't really make sense. So I'm not sure exactly what they were aiming for there. But if it had a T-slot channel in the front here, you could at least pop T-nuts in here, and then you would have the ability to bolt on something like a button box, like what you can see here, just bolted directly in to the channels on this piece of aluminium profile. Now you can work around that, of course, by using a couple of 90-degree angle brackets like that. You can bolt those on and then bolt a piece of aluminium profile to it like that. But what are we doing here? That's just so unnecessary. To me, it just would have made more sense to have a T-slot rail along here that we could bolt stuff into, and then you could put an angle bracket on here, you could bolt it in however you want, and it would just give you a lot more in terms of overall expandability and adjustment that would be available. Or at least some sort of a clamp or something like what we saw with the shifter mount that allows you to have a mounting face on the front here without having to buy additional brackets and adapters, which of course are going to introduce various different levels of flex as well. So look, I mean, this looks cool. It looks nice and clean in your living room, and it does give you the ability to mount stuff. So, you know, it does work. But the design itself just doesn't make any sense. Even to the extent where I thought that maybe we'd mounted them upside down or back to front, because, you know, why would you have the T-slot rail on the back here but not on the front? But then, of course, if you flip them around, then it's bending away from you and not towards you, which doesn't make any sense either. So, yeah, I'm not 100% certain exactly what they were thinking there. Everything else on the rig, I think, pretty much speaks for itself in terms of expandability. As I said before, obviously there are going to be some sacrifices there when you're choosing a tube frame cockpit over an aluminium profile cockpit. But yeah, in terms of this particular cockpit, literally the only places where you can bolt things on are just to these rails, to the left and right rails if you purchase those as accessories. If you don't purchase those, then you literally don't have anywhere on the rig that you can bolt anything unless you use some sort of a clamp or some sort of a fabricated mechanism to get the job done. So look, I mean, it's about what I was expecting, but just I was expecting these to be a lot less limited in what they allowed you to do, given their intended purpose. The design, to me at least, just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So yeah, maybe I'm missing something, but yeah. This is what it is. You guys can judge for yourselves. One thing I do really like though in terms of expandability is what they've done with the PC tray. So let's just quickly have a look at the front of the cockpit, run you through that, and then we'll get into the overall driving experience. So this is the PC tray accessory. And while it's certainly not necessary, I think it is actually quite cool the way that they've integrated this. So you do have some adjustability here. You can slide this whole front section in and out. You basically just loosen the two bolts on either side and just slide it in, slide it out. I'll put some measurements up on the screen for you guys in case you are interested in that. But once the PC is up on top of it, let's grab a case now and pop it up there. You can see it does, for a standard sort of mid or full ATX tower, fit quite nicely. Absolutely no issues whatsoever. And that does get your PC up off the ground, so it's less likely to take on dust, dirt, debris, and so forth. So look, I probably wouldn't worry about it if it were me buying it, but for those of you who like to have a nice, clean, integrated system like this, then yeah, it does work quite well. One thing I did notice, however, if I just quickly grab the tower back down again, is the way they've designed this, it only actually fixes in terms of bolts to the chassis here and here. The rest of it is just resting against the cockpit. So you can see it's got these sort of cup-shaped bits here that fit around the tube, and those aren't actually fixed to the cockpit in any way. So look, that's absolutely fine because the weight is all in front of it, so it just rests down there. It's not going to fall off or anything like that, so that's not a concern. The only thing I would say is that I would have liked to have seen some little felt inserts underneath these pieces, simply because if you are running high vibration on your rig, remembering again that this isn't really designed to be used with a motion platform, and especially if you were using a motion platform, I wouldn't recommend having your PC fixed to the rig that was moving anyway, simply because vibrations and things aren't good for the components in your PC. But it does do that. So yeah, if you are running vibrations through here, you will notice that getting, I guess, amplified through the rig, through these pieces. So yeah, a little bit of rubber or felt underneath these will fix that problem. Something that you can easily pick up yourself, but something that I would have liked to have seen them include in the kit. But otherwise, I think it works really well, particularly when you consider the cable management that they've integrated into this rig, which does work very, very nicely. So you've got a couple of holes, one on either side. You can see one just there. There's then another one located just here. So that allows us to pass cables conveniently to our PC tray area. It then continues down through the tube, and there's another hole, whereabouts is it? Just here as well, so just here. And that allows us to bring cables through for our power supplies, our pedals, and so forth. There's also a little cable tray that sits underneath the pedal tray too. So you can mount all your power supplies and bits and pieces underneath there. And that does work really well. It hides everything away really nicely, very, very tidy and clean. And the end result is a genuinely really nice, clean and tidy setup. You can internally manage pretty much all of the cables. They do include some little Velcro straps as well, so that will help you strap cables together. You do just, of course, need to make sure that you do leave enough cable length everywhere where you've got adjustments so that you're not going to rip cables out or destroy connectors when you do slide things forward and back, particularly with these Fanatec wheelbases. One of the things that I have mentioned in my reviews of those is that the reinforcement or lack thereof of the connectors on the PCB means that if you do tear the wheelbase away, it can tear the whole connection off the board, and yeah, that's going to be a bad day for you. So absolutely make sure you have enough length that you can go through the full scale of adjustment there. But yeah, the cable management is particularly clean and tidy with this rig. And particularly if you are using an integrated PC mount, you can run all your power cables down to the ground very conveniently, all of your internal cables up to where the monitor sits, where the wheelbase sits, and everything. The only external cables you're gonna have to worry about are just the cables running down to your shifter and handbrake or any other accessories that you might have mounted around the rig, keyboard, mouse, for example. Everything else can be managed internally, and it does make for a very living room friendly and clean design. Okay, so up until this point in the video, I've been trying to sort of just show you guys all of the objective facts so you can make a judgment for yourself on whether this is gonna be a product or not for you. Obviously, being a tube frame cockpit, it's not gonna be suitable for absolutely everybody. Everybody's gonna have certain things that they're gonna be looking for in a cockpit, and you know, it may or may not suit those just based on what it is, rather than whether or not it's a good implementation of a fundamental design, so to speak. So this is the part of the video now where we're gonna start to get into my subjective opinions based on testing this rig out extensively over the last couple of weeks. Now, you can probably already see we have stripped this thing back quite a bit. One of the things Tom and I both agreed on pretty quickly here was that it was kind of a much better value for money product if you stripped it back to its sort of basics and treated it as a, you know, a less expensive, less fully featured, but, you know, does what it does and does what it does very well style cockpit, rather than something that tries to sort of have bolt-on bits and pieces everywhere to sort of try and compete with an aluminium profile rig. I think we've kind of accepted that it is a tube frame cockpit. It's never going to compete with a aluminium profile cockpit in terms of just pure expandability. So we kind of started to look at it from that perspective a little bit more, and we stripped off some of the stuff that we weren't such a big fan of. The biggest weakness in terms of the driving experience, absolutely without a doubt, was that bar going across here that we talked about with the shifter and handbrake mounted to it. Again, you can see in the driving footage here, there is a lot of flex there, and it does seem to be mostly just inherent to the quality of the materials that they're using there. I don't think that it's a fundamentally bad design, but we've already covered that pretty extensively when we were talking about flex a little bit earlier on, so no need to go over all that again. But when you strip it back to a basic cockpit like this, it does actually work pretty well. There are a couple of areas that I still feel could use improvement in terms of things like flex, particularly in the wheel deck. Did notice with both the Fanatec and bottom mount, as well as the front mount that we ended up testing with the SimbiCube 2 Pro, that there was more flex than I was comfortable with there. It's not something that you notice when you're driving in terms of the wheel moving, but jumping between this and some of my other rigs that don't have any flex, particularly with these modern wheelbases we were discussing before that have these high fidelity, high frequency effects, it absolutely unequivocally does have a damping effect on those kinds of high frequency effects. So you won't notice it if you just buy one of these and it's your first cockpit. You probably won't think that the flex is a big deal. If you were to jump out of a more solid rig into this, you're gonna have a similar experience to me. You're gonna go, hang on, this just doesn't feel quite as good as it did before. Otherwise, we did just notice a couple of limitations when it comes to the integrated monitor mount that I didn't mention earlier on in the video. Firstly, the fact that you are limited in how far forward you can bring it. So if you do want to have your monitor placed between your wheel and your wheelbase, for example, you probably are going to struggle to achieve that with this particular mount. It is going to depend obviously on the screen size that you have. You could use things like spacers, and they do actually include some spacers to help out with positioning and making sure that this is going to be compatible with a wider variety of monitors as possible. But at the end of the day, you are going to have to make other compromises. So you'd have to push the wheel back, which means you'd have to move the seat forward. You may run out of reach then in terms of the pedal tray sliding back and forth. So I would say if you are somebody that's wanting to get the monitor in the absolutely perfect position, you probably are better off looking at a either Fanatec's or some other standalone monitor mount. And we will check out the Fanatec one that you saw earlier on in today's video in a separate video a little bit later on. The other limitation I did notice is that if you have a monitor that has all the plugs on the back of it, you may find that you're not able to plug in without having a spacer between this arm and the monitor to be able to plug the cables in and then bend them down within a safe radius. So you can see in this footage here that some of the ports on the back of my monitor were completely blocked by this. I was just lucky that the power and the HDMI port happened to be outside this area, so it didn't affect me, but of course it will vary significantly depending on the monitor that you're using. I did notice that the monitor did have a tendency to move around a little bit if you touched it, but just under normal driving conditions without any sort of haptics on the rig other than just what's being generated by the wheelbase and the motors on the pedals. You guys can judge for yourselves from the driving footage whether it's something that you notice, and otherwise pretty much everything works as intended. So I would say on the positive side, the standout things here are the overall adjustability of what's here, particularly the ability to slide the pedals, the wheelbase and the seat all independently of each other. A lot of cockpits that we've tested out over the years, one movement sort of depends on another. If you remember back to my reviews of a lot of the next level racing profile cockpits, for example, when you move the pedal tray, you end up having to move the wheel deck at the same time, and everything's kind of intertwined and interlinked, whereas this does have genuine independent adjustability of each individual element. The only thing not available there is a large scope of movement in terms of height of the wheel. So you will rely on raising or lowering the seat and the pedal tray to get your seating position right relative to the height of the wheelbase, but you do have all the angle adjustment, everything that we talked about before. So on the positive side, I would definitely say that if you're somebody that's looking for a cockpit that can have different drivers jump in and out regularly and not have to spend a couple of minutes between different drivers adjusting things, because I mean, look, if you've ever been in that situation, you know that it's just too frustrating. You just don't end up doing it. This is probably the best cockpit that I've ever tested in terms of ease of adjustment between different drivers. So yeah, that is definitely a strong selling point with this cockpit, I would say. So all in all, I'm left with this kind of awkward feeling that, you know, they've started out with this really great design that really does achieve a lot of the things that sim racers are looking for, obviously with the limitations that you would expect to come with a tube frame style design. But then that awesome, well-engineered design that's obviously been done by people that really fundamentally understand sim racing has gone to the wider team. The wider team have then tried to figure out how they can reduce cost, and you know, that has resulted in corners being cut in terms of production quality, and that's led to issues like the, you know, the badly threaded holes that we talked about, the slightly misaligned welding, the material thickness in some areas like we discussed not being quite sufficient to provide the rigidity that they could otherwise have. And yeah, it just leaves me in this kind of awkward state of disappointment for what could have been an absolutely incredible product, but just doesn't quite hit the mark that I had hoped to at this kind of price point. Now, I know that it is a ClubSport branded product, and that does open the gate to potentially there being a podium version of this later on down the line that may fix a lot of those issues. But then you've also got to consider the price point. This is trading blows price-wise with aluminium profile cockpits that sit at the very top of the line and provide all the rigidity, all the adaptability, and all the expandability that you could ever want in a cockpit without the sacrifices that you're making here. And like I said, while this might be more suitable in some cases for people that want to be able to, you know, jump in and out with different body shapes and different sizes all the time, I would rather have something that I can set up for myself, knowing that it's very rare that I have other people in my rig anyway, and I want to have it as rigid as possible at as low a price point as possible. So I don't quite think that this hits the mark in terms of what I would personally look for in a cockpit. But if I was looking to build something for my living room, something minimal, something nice and clean and tidy in terms of cable management as well, then this would definitely still be on my list. So it really just depends on what you're looking at. There were a couple of other little corners cut here and there as well. One thing that did stand out to me in particular, I didn't mention earlier, is those cable pass-throughs that we talked about. They don't have any rubber grommets or any sort of sleeve on them at all. So you are passing cables past sharp metal. And I did actually notice a couple of scuff marks on some of the cables that we passed through. So while most of the time that's not going to be a dangerous thing because you're only going to be working with low voltage, if you were trying to pass a power cable up to a monitor or something like that, that could potentially be dangerous. And I know that, you know, in the construction and electronics world, something like that certainly wouldn't pass. Anytime you're putting a cable through a metal channel, it always has to have some sort of a rubber grommet there. So I'm surprised that they didn't, you know, again, it's just these little corners that have been cut here and there that take something that could have been so much better back to being something that is okay, but not as good as it could have been. So to summarize, where I sit with it is this: if what this is represents exactly what you're looking for in a cockpit, I definitely don't think that you're going to be disappointed with it. You do just need to be aware of the things that we've highlighted here in comparison with some other styles of cockpits that have, you know, strengths and weaknesses in different areas. So hopefully by now you understand where the weaknesses are in this. I don't think that it's inherently bad design at all. I actually think it's a really great design, probably one of the best I've seen in terms of cockpits, but just the implementation isn't quite where I feel it needs to be for me to feel comfortable recommending it for everybody that's looking at a tube style frame cockpit. Now there are a couple of other ones out there like the Track Racer TRX, for example, that we haven't tested yet. So I can't compare this to absolutely everything in the market, but I can certainly tell you that for me personally and what I look for in a cockpit, I would certainly choose a high-end aluminium profile cockpit at a similar price point to what you'd be paying for this and not have to deal with the issues that we came across in this review. So yeah, if you're looking for a nice, clean looking design cockpit that is going to be nice and easily adaptable for different drivers, I really think where this would be ideally suited is some sort of a commercial environment like a trade show or, you know, a sim racing center or something like that, because it is really great being able to make those adjustments on the fly like what we discussed. But I just feel like when you factor all that stuff in, the extra machining, the extra parts, all of the extra complexity that comes with having those adjustments has meant that they've had to pull quality away from other areas of the cockpit, which introduces flex. So it is just purely going to come down to what you subjectively prioritize in a cockpit. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you have already purchased one of these, let us know whether you've come across the same issues that we did in our testing. As I mentioned before, we did put a couple of posts up on social media talking about the assembly process, and it was about a 50-50 split between people that said they had no issue and people that had the same issues that we did. So yeah, I'd be really interested to continue that discussion and learn from you guys what your experience has been like. And yeah, I always say the most value in these review videos always comes from the comments down below, because that's where you can get people's real world experiences. I can only share my own experience, but I really do hope that this video has helped you out. Don't forget those discount codes and affiliate links down in the description box and over on boostedmedia.net as well. If you are looking at picking up any sim racing gear, whether it's this cockpit or anything else, that is a great way of helping support the channel at no additional cost, and even potentially saving yourselves a little bit of money in the process as well. Check out all our other reviews of various different cockpits as well. We will be continuing to review these style of cockpits too. I'm particularly interested in reviewing that TRX cockpit from Track Race that we talked about before, to see whether it has the same shortcomings as this. But that will do for today's video. Stay tuned for more detail on the freestanding triple and single monitor mount, as well as the pedal inversion kit and some other bits and pieces. But thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.